As a direct sequel to the massively successful Resident Evil 7, Village had huge shoes to fill. Capcom's leap of faith to the first-person perspective paid off big, and it was quickly determined that the next entry in the series would follow the same perspective. Naturally, there are going to be plenty of comparisons between the two, and judging from discourse online, any deviation from fans' beloved Biohazard has been met with intense scrutiny. But really, despite what Village has borrowed from the series' action-oriented entries like Resident Evil 4 and 5, it also improves on what made Resident Evil 7 so great. Instead of reviewing Village as a standalone product, I wanted to point out how it compares to Biohazard and how it improves on such a terrifying experience. I'll be spoiling pretty much all of Resident Evil 7 as well as the encounters in Village. I won't go into Village's deep story reveals, but if you're the type of person who likes to know as little as possible going into a game, then I'd suggest coming back to this video after you've already completed the story. Resident Evil 7 was a game that took me by surprise. Its aesthetic was reverent of American horror. Each section is divided up into different horror subgenres that were popularized in America. Jack represented the unstoppable slasher who just won't stay dead. Marguerite represented the demonic occult with tinges of The Exorcist, and Lucas was an homage to the torture porn subgenre reminiscent of Saw. All of this concluded with the reveal of how the whole game tied into the rest of the series and answered the mysteries of what was really going on. Its setting was also distinctly American, a rundown, decaying property that was left to rot in a humid Louisiana swamp. Subtle window shakes and floorboard creaks made sure you never felt safe, and much like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, what was unsettling about the Baker estate wasn't whether or not a place like that really existed, but that it could exist. Resident Evil Village takes the same approach, but instead chooses Europe. Rather than murky marshlands, Ethan is exploring staples of horror from across the European continent. For example, there are general themes of paganism and child sacrifice throughout. Lady Dimitrescu's castle is probably the most Victorian thing to ever exist in a video game. Vampires themselves originated throughout Europe, and the concept of exploring a dark abandoned castle is about as classic horror as it gets. Donna Beneviento represents the creepy doll subgenre, as well as psychological horror. She's also responsible for what might be the most terrifying monster in the entire game. Salvatore Moreau feels like a grim fairy tale inspired freak from the pages of Hunchback of Notre Dame or Rumpelstiltskin. He's extremely pathetic and only cares about helping Miranda succeed, so he'll prove how useful he is. For some reason, his desperation makes him even more unsettling, and for me, he was the most interesting lord in the game. And finally, Heisenberg's area might be the most beautiful. A factory where humans are made into mechanical warriors to fight back against Mother Miranda, his entire kingdom is a tribute to the mechanical body horror genre. Every enemy feels like a piece of Giger-esque concept art come to life. And all of this is within the backdrop of a creepy, snow-covered village, where everything inside is either near death or completely expired. After Ethan meets the last coalition of humans left to combat the hordes of monsters, they quickly succumb to hostile forces, and the kindness of the villagers is repaid in their rapid demise. Village establishes early on that this is not a game about uniting survivors, but exploring a wasteland and what remains of an unassuming remote village. So much so that game director Morimasa Sato considers the village to be the second most important character in the entire game. Much like the Baker estate, the village feels like a place that could really exist. As you pass through the various ruined homesteads and journal entries, you can't help but picture what this place looked like before its inhabitants became experiments. I'm sure somewhere a remote village like this exists, with contemporary but limited technology and a fringe religion that worships a pagan deity. This idea, coupled with modern graphics capable of rendering such a photorealistic locale, create a living, unsettling presence in a place so dead and lifeless. Some parts are claustrophobic, other parts are evocative, and all of it is memorable. And not that the Baker estate isn't any of those things, but the village just feels like that concept upscaled and brilliantly executed. There are people out there who say Resident Evil Village isn't scary, and I have no idea what game those people played, but it clearly wasn't this one. So much so that I'd argue this game is even scarier than Resident Evil 7. And a lot of that is due to the sound design, where twigs are constantly snapping, brushes moving, etc. But what really helps convey that horror is an often forgotten element of survival horror: power. Part of the joy of survival horror is your progression. I remember feeling just as relieved as Ethan at the end of Resident Evil 7 when I thought about how I transitioned from a helpless captor at the hands of Jack to a killing machine capable of destroying a gigantic mold monster. But in video games, that security comes at the cost of fear. By the time I reached Lucas's stage of RE7, I felt like I was in total control and that I could shoot my way out of any challenge he threw at me. So for comparison's sake, let's run through how power changes throughout Resident Evil Village. First, Lady Dimitrescu stalks you, same as Jack. She's completely invincible, and sometimes you're even stalked by her daughters at the same time, who are also invincible. Power is almost non-existent until after her boss fight. In Donna's section, you can't even use your guns, so again, power never plays a role. Moreau transforms into an unstoppable fish monster you have to navigate around for his entire stage. And Heisenberg's factory has such tough enemies and limited visibility that despite your arsenal of weapons at this point, you never know if it's enough to get you past what's around the next corner. And besides Village's bosses, RE7's generic mold monsters don't hold a candle to Village's enemies. Lycans, zombies, and ghouls all feel primal and terrifying, not to mention the memorable mini-bosses littered throughout. This is also why Ethan needs to be such a wet blanket. Because he's just a regular guy, you can feel the power imbalance when he goes up against a 9-foot-tall vampire. And I'll contrast the feeling of playing as Ethan with the Chris section later in the game, which is deliberately designed to make you feel unstoppable. You're the legendary Chris Redfield, boasted by a Spec Ops team with an advanced arsenal of weapons. Even though hordes of enemies are being thrown at you, you're meant to feel powerful, and the whole thing feels like a Call of Duty mission. And on the topic of scary, I wanted to briefly talk about the endings of these games. You could make the argument that both the final sections of RE7 and Village ruin the mystery of what's happening. When it's revealed who these monsters are and how they're innocent people who were caught up in experiments by Umbrella, it's the narrative equivalent of the villain in a horror movie getting explained at the halfway point.
The symbol is associated with a pagan deity named Bagul. He consumes the souls of human children.
The Bakers suddenly aren't as terrifying in subsequent playthroughs when you realize they're just really nice people, just like the gothic horror elements of Village only exist because of a crazy science experiment.
I'm no killer, son. Neither is Marguerite, nor my boy Lucas, or even Zoe here. That girl Evelyn, she did this.
And yeah, I don't think Village is that much better at this than RE7 is, but I thought I'd mention it since it's kind of a weakness both games share. Perhaps my favorite thing about Resident Evil Village is actually its length. As games get longer and longer and publishers pressure developers to create games that incentivize daily logins and monetization, people have gotten sick of the gigantic open world experience. I practically dread when a big release comes out, knowing I'll have to carve out a schedule to finish it in a reasonable amount of time. A lot of these games are packed with filler to create more perceived value despite being full of aimless side content. Resident Evil Village's direction is brilliant because it respects the player's time. Your first playthrough will be a tight 10 to 12 hours. All the environments feel so detailed and lived in, and each boss fight feels specially crafted. The entire game is the good part of the game, and very few games can honestly say that. Like other games in this series, Village is designed with multiple playthroughs in mind. Whether you're exploring optional side content, leveling guns to unlock infinite ammo, or just trying a challenge like beating the game in under 3 hours, there's genuine replayability. Obviously, RE7 is also a pretty tight game too, but the pacing is killed by this stupid tanker section. I remember each Baker section vividly, but this whole last stretch of the game feels like a blur. There really aren't any parts that drag in Village, and while I think it's a close contest, RE7's final hours really hold it back in comparison. So all in all, I love both games, but I really just think Village is the better game. It improves on so much of what was great in Biohazard, and contrary to popular belief, I don't believe that the Resident Evil 4 elements like the weapon upgrading and the in-game economy hold it back at all. But of course, please let me know what you think about both games in the comment section below, and thank you for watching.